Hi, welcome to the Malcolm Roberts Show. Our aims are to restore our country and our planet for humans to flourish. This is Senator Malcolm Roberts in our state of Queensland, Australia. Thank you for having me as your guest in your car, kitchen, shed, lounge, barbecue, or wherever you are right now, sitting, standing, driving, walking, running, laying down, exercising, whatever. Our show's two themes, as a reminder, are freedom, specifically freedom replacing control, the eternal human struggle, and secondly, responsibility, specifically personal responsibility and integrity. History repeatedly proves that both freedom and responsibility are essential for human progress and for people's livelihoods and safety. When we look behind or beyond the few villains and exploiters that get publicity, the Hitlers, the Stalins, the Chairman Maos, human history reveals a wonderfully positive and rich story of human achievement and progress. I'm not suggesting we ignore the vicious, the nasty, and the greedy, nor the pain they wreak. Yet look directly into them and beyond them to understand the bigger picture in human evolution and progress. Today, we welcome 5 guests. All are truly amazing people, and I mean that so sincerely. I am in awe of these people. Wonderful citizens, knowledgeable in their fields, involved in their community, involved in our society, fearless and forthright, and aware of politics, caring, strong, and courageous. Our 5 guests will discuss and debate a real-life topic that confronted us all within the context of serious dilemmas due to the deceitful COVID mismanagement. That topic is civil disobedience. For example, look at the mismanagement around COVID lockdowns, inhuman, nonsensical, contradictory and dishonest directives and injection mandates that gave people a choice between going against fundamental principles and beliefs and breaking the law and edicts, a choice of harming their health or keeping their job in order to feed their children, and so many other restrictions and inconsistencies. Fundamentally, though, the purpose of today's show is to protect democracy. Now, to give you context, about a year ago, I heard an amazing address by Emeritus Professor of Law, Gabriel Moens. He delivered a wonderful, thoughtful, and thought-provoking lecture on civil disobedience. And as a result of that thought-provocation, we're having this podcast today. He's an award-winning, courageous, outspoken author and lawyer with diverse international experience. After him will be Topher. Topher is one of Australia's most astute and powerful thinkers on politics, media and society. And he says it in a very practical way, way that connects. During COVID mismanagement, he practiced civil disobedience in a civil and powerful way. He's the author of the book, Good People Break Bad Laws. Next will be Professor James Allan. He's Professor Moens' replacement as Garrick Professor of Law. He has experience in Canada, America, Britain, New Zealand and Australia. A fearless, clever, outspoken commentator on university and society, and a wicked sense of humour that could come out at any minute, so be prepared. Professor Augusto Zimmermann, with diverse international experience, and he's worked in several Australian states, a prolific author and live wire and commenting on society, holds no punches. And the 5th of our guests is Professor David Flint, member of the Order of Australia, lawyer, admired and loved across Australia and outspoken on so many issues. One of my first guests on this show. Another award winner with diverse experience who speaks clearly and decisively on politics. Is a media host and champion of civil liberties and of our Constitution. These are among Australia's finest citizens and finest humans. Now, just to give some context, I have a list of 8 keys to human progress. The first and fundamental one, nothing happens without this, is freedom. Freedom of exchanging ideas and innovative concepts so that people can build on them and build on each other's work. Secondly is rule of law, fundamental to stability. And thirdly is a constitution that enables stable succession of government, because we have to replace governments periodically. I won't go into the other 5. Proper laws enable orderliness and efficiency if they're designed to serve the people. Our democratic government is very important to me, to us all of my guests, and to us all around Australia. Democratic government is vital for safety, prosperity, and human progress. It's not perfect, but it's the only one that works. The purpose of today's show is to protect democracy. Our democratic representative parliamentary government is founded on centuries of proven experience, and it has withstood many tests, including some of the foundations are Britain's Magna Carta in 1215, Britain's Westminster system of democratic parliamentary representative government, America's Declaration of Independence in 1776, and America's Constitution as amended. Today's show is in response to destructive forces that threatened our democracy when governments' responses to COVID abandoned democracy and many of our society's founding principles. Specifically, federal and state government deceit, reckless and willful mismanagement, and arbitrary, inhuman, capricious, contradictory directives and abuses put many generally and usually law-abiding people into breaches of law, and huge, life-destroying, and at times downright inhuman dilemmas and traps. In doing this, MPs and bureaucrats abused and destroyed our democracy. I want to listen to and share alternatives that people can assess if governments misbehave in future. My guests and I empathize with people trapped in this real-world dilemma, and one of them was trapped, Topher, in this dilemma and confrontation that placed citizens in a diabolical and traumatic position, often triggering suicide or lifelong trauma. I remind MPs and bureaucrats of the fact that during deceitful COVID mismanagement, citizens around our country were treated inhumanely and as a result are now awake. That's the silver lining. And I want to introduce in this podcast the need to return to responsible ethical laws that protect people's basic rights. Personally, as a lawmaker, I initially seemed trapped when COVID started raising its head. As a maker of laws, how could I break laws and orders, even if the laws and orders were made dishonestly? At first, I complied with the proclaimed threats to health. After a few months, literally just 3 months, I held Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk accountable in writing. I invited them to provide me with the data. What I got back from both of them was crap, lies. And then again in August, same thing. 4 times they responded with nothing in the way of information. I then did my best to get information from the Chief Medical Officer and the Health Department and various government agencies to stop the distortions and to revoke arbitrary controls. I sought in various ways to change the orders. I initiated and led 2 inquiries with members of Parliament from across many parties. After seeing people suffering and the truth still being blatantly suppressed despite stark numerical data and evidence, I'm wondering what I can do and what will I do next time the state and federal governments abuse the people. How will I awaken more quickly, awaken from the start of any deceit? Because my responsibility is to serve the people, I represent the people. So let's start our first topic. Welcome, Professor Moens. Could you please introduce the concept of civil disobedience that our panel will discuss and, when necessary, argue and debate?
Yes, thank you very much for your introduction, Senator. It was a very passionate introduction, and I would also like to welcome my colleagues on this panel. In the early 1970s, in fact, in 1970, the Sydney Morning Herald published a number of excellent, truly excellent articles on civil disobedience. And one of the participants was a professor at the University of Sydney. His name was Ilmar Tamelo. Ilmar Tamelo was an Estonian, and he was a reader in law at the University of Sydney Law School. In one of his articles published by the Sydney Morning Herald, Professor Tamelo argued that once people start to violate laws, then they are on a slippery slope because you don't know where it will take you. In fact, he said in one of his articles, and I got it in front of me, and I quote, "Defiance of an allegedly unjust law leads to awkward practical consequences because on critically important occasions, it may be extremely difficult to ascertain what is just and what is unjust." Frankly, when I read this, I was surprised. And I was surprised for a number of reasons. First of all, Professor Tamelo was my mentor. He is actually the reason why I am in Australia. But I was also surprised because he did his doctorate in Germany during the Second World War. And therefore, I expected that after the war, he would have a type of Radbruch conversion. And I expected him to embrace notions of natural law or probably divine law or moral principles. But that did not happen. Professor Tamelo remained a very strong supporter of legal positivism. In any event, I only mention these articles which were published in the Sydney Morning Herald because I very much encourage listeners to really read these articles because they are truly excellent. They are the best articles that I have ever read about civil disobedience. And as the senator said in his introduction, civil disobedience, especially the concept of civil disobedience, was also the topic of my lecture, my address to the Church and State Conference last year in 2023. In my lecture, I concentrated on the concept and the consequences of civil disobedience. Let me first tell you what, according to me, are the essential components of civil disobedience. There are three of them. First, civil disobedience is a deliberate violation of a valid law, a deliberate violation of a formally valid law. Second, the formally valid law is violated because it is allegedly incompatible with the higher principles, say, for example, moral or religious principles or dictates. Now, these are two very important components, but these two important components are not enough to define the concept of civil disobedience. And that is, if you limit yourself to these two components, probably sometimes we would not be able to distinguish between a criminal and a civil disobedience. A criminal, for example, also violates a law, but a criminal may violate the law because the law is incompatible with the criminal's higher principles, for example, the principle of self-interest. Clearly, such a person is a criminal and not a civil disobedient. In order to distinguish, though, between a criminal and a true civil disobedient, we need to add a third requirement, a third essential component to the concept of civil disobedience. And that is that a civil disobedient is engaged in an act of civil disobedience in order to bring about social change, desirable social change. And if you concentrate on this third requirement, we can easily come to the conclusion that therefore, ideally, an act of civil disobedience should be publicly performed. Because if an act of civil disobedience is only privately performed in your home, for example, then nobody will know that you are involved in civil disobedience, and therefore you are not going to change society at all. So preferably it has to be a public act, very important. And also an act of civil disobedience as a consequence again of my third requirement, my third component, an act of civil disobedience should be non-violent. And this is because a lawbreaker, a civil disobedient, does not aim at destroying society. They aim at getting rid of instances of societal injustice. And I assume that we are going to discuss many of these instances of societal injustice in this program. So all of this came out of my reading these excellent articles which were published in 1970. And I think they provide us with lots of information, some of which no doubt will come out in this show. Over to you, Senator.
Thank you very much, Professor Moens. That was a very concise and powerful summary and illustration of the key points. Topher, could you now tell us a bit about your civil disobedience, please? Because I think you complied with all of those requirements that Professor Moens just gave us.
Well, thank you so much, Senator. And firstly, let me say, when you invited me to join, I thought you must have sent the invitation to the wrong place, because I find myself sitting here with a sitting senator and four professors, all of which I have great respect for. And in fact, I have some of their books sitting behind me and scattered elsewhere in the house. So thank you so much for the invitation. I actually want to continue where Professor Moens left off, and I wholeheartedly endorse every point that he made. I want to read a few quotes from people who are known throughout history, and these are compiled in the front of my book here. And this is really the foundation from which I was working. Martin Luther King Jr. stated that one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws, and conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And he makes the point, and I think this is a really important one here, an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. And I want to pick up on a point you made in your introduction, Senator, that this is not about undermining democracy. This is not about creating a lawless situation. It's about obeying a higher law. And Howard Zinn made this point, and Howard Zinn's not everyone's cup of tea, but I used his quote here because I wanted to illustrate that this principle of civil disobedience is understood across the political spectrum. He said that protest beyond the law is not a departure from democracy, but it is absolutely essential to it. And final quote here, Mahatma Gandhi says, "I have disregarded the order served upon me, not for want of respect for lawful authority, but in obedience to the higher law of our being, the voice of conscience." And so that's really the foundation on which I stood. And I would continue on from Professor Moen's comments and say, there are many people who try and use civil disobedience and use protest as a couching of their own criminal tendencies. If you're burning a building down, or if you're committing acts of vandalism, you've gone beyond protest. You're now into common criminality. And that's a distinction that people like myself, who do believe very passionately in the power and the importance of civil disobedience, that's a distinction that we need to reinforce at every opportunity, because there is a right way to do it. There is a wrong way to do it. And it was picked up there in Mahatma Gandhi's comments that the purpose is to prick the conscience of the community over the injustice of a law. For me, I was a law-abiding citizen, possibly to a fault, arguably too law-abiding, too much of a goody two-shoes until I was 38 years old, where I was compelled to walk out my door and deliberately and very publicly defy the lockdown orders. I lived in Victoria. I lived in Melbourne at the time. I'd lived there since I was 2 years old. It was very much my home city and a place that I loved. And I saw the harm that was being done, the devastation that was happening all around me as a result of the lockdowns. These were, of course, a one-size-fits-all solution to a virus that has a very asymmetrical risk profile. I would have supported resources being spent on protecting the genuinely vulnerable, but I could not in good conscience sit idle while so many lives were destroyed from people that were really at very low risk from the virus. And in addition, I would argue that these lockdowns were not something that a government in a liberal democracy has the remit to actually impose in the first place. But that's a more principles-based issue we can get to a little bit later on. So I found myself, I published a video on the 31st of March, I believe it was, 2020, making the argument that we needed to target our protection to the vulnerable and let everyone else go free. And by the end of April, when these lockdowns were just being extended, and it had become very obvious that there was no plan in place, they didn't have a strategy for getting us through the pandemic. They were simply going to keep us in the pandemic by extending these lockdowns indefinitely. That was when I decided that I needed to engage in disobedience. And I was invited to speak at a protest, or it turned out to be the very first sort of formal anti-lockdown protest that took place. Over the following 18 months, I involuntarily found myself as very much one of the faces, not the only, but one of the faces of that movement. I've been vilified in the media. I've been called every single name under the sun. I had police visiting my home, and ultimately I was arrested, and I spent 2.5 years fighting criminal charges. Now, those charges, to be clear, the police in their brief against me acknowledged the fact that at no point did I commit any acts of vandalism, violence, intimidation, nothing. There was nothing that you or I or any reasonable adult would consider to be actual criminal behavior. The criminal charges stemmed entirely from the fact that I was participating in and encouraging others to participate in peaceful, non-violent civil disobedience by engaging in protest at a time when the government had the audacity to claim that protest was illegal. So what we saw in that movement was I think, very, very instructive. And you can watch for free my documentary, Battleground Melbourne. It's free. Just go to battlegroundmelbourne.com. It's an hour and 40 minutes long. It's a feature-length documentary. It's won 14 awards internationally, so it's not just me that thinks it's pretty good. It's done very well. But unfortunately, not enough people have seen it. Not enough of those lessons have been learned. But I had the privilege of watching many, many good people. Initially, only 70 people showed up at that very first protest, but our numbers grew. And eventually, by the time it was all said and done in late 2021, we had the largest protests that the city of Melbourne has ever seen before. And we captured all of those on camera, and I was able to incorporate those into the documentary. One of the most common questions that I get asked when I talk about civil disobedience, and it's the third chapter in this book because it's such an important question, is how do we know when a law is bad? It's all very well and good to say good people break bad laws. What is that? How do we know? And we can't just have a situation where everyone is just running around doing whatever they want, including criminal activity. So how do we know what is a bad law? And then how do we know what is valid, legitimate civil disobedience? And I'll only give the very briefest of answers to that right now, because I'm sure we'll explore those issues a lot more later on. But I propose two tests to determine whether a law is bad. One of those tests is utilitarian, and the other one is principles-based. Utilitarianism is useful, but also dangerous. And we need to always reference it back to the actual principles that matter. The utilitarian test is, does obeying or enforcing this law cause more harm than breaking? And I would argue in the case of lockdowns, and again in the case of the vaccine mandates, more harm was caused by the enforcement and the enacting of those laws than by the breaking of those laws. So in my opinion, the COVID lockdowns failed the utilitarian test, but on its own, utilitarianism, like I said, is useful, but can be very dangerous. We must always come back to principles. So my principles test is, does the government actually have the legitimate authority to do this in the first place? And I don't want to go too deep into political philosophy, and I'm sitting here with men who are immensely more qualified than me to do that. But I would put it to you that in a liberal democracy where the government receives its power from the consent of the governed, that they do not in fact have the power to simply tell everyone to stay home as a blanket quarantine, regardless of whether they are known to be infectious or not. So in my opinion, these laws failed both of those tests, and therefore were a legitimate object of civil disobedience, despite what the consequences may turn out to be for me. The second question becomes, what's the legitimate response? How do we make sure that we're engaging in civil disobedience and not common criminality? And that is, as Professor Moens said, peacefulness. The minute there is violence, the minute there is property destruction, the minute there is intimidation and the targeting of politicians or these sorts of things, you've stepped outside of the bounds of legitimate civil disobedience, in my opinion. And the objective has to be, and I make this point in my book, and it really comes from some of those quotes that I just gave you there, as well as others that are in the book. The objective is to change the laws, as Professor Moens correctly pointed out. And in order to do that, you must win the support of the public that are not engaging in the civil disobedience. They're not there with you. They don't agree with you yet. And so the manner in which you engage with that civil disobedience must be such that it entices them and draws them and highlights to them the injustice. And people who engage in violence or property damage in the name of civil disobedience are actually doing their cause a great deal of harm, and are pushing people away from the very thing that they should be trying to draw them to. So that's why throughout that 18 months, I was staunchly peaceful in my own right. And I also have on camera, because I would live stream from the protests, I have on camera multiple occasions where I intervened to stop my fellow protesters from going too far, or to bring them back from having gone too far, and to correct their course because they were beginning to engage in acts that were not, in my opinion, in keeping with that principle. So those are my opening thoughts on civil disobedience. And yeah, the documentary Battleground Melbourne is the best place to go if you don't know my story. Grab that URL and watch that once you've finished watching this. Thank you so much, Senator.
Thank you so much, Topher. Very, very clear. Professor Allan, over to you. Your thoughts.
Thank you, Malcolm, for having me with this distinguished group of colleagues and friends. Just so that the listeners get, or our viewers get, a sense of how unrepresentative we all are. We would be four of the law professors in the country out of maybe 6 who were against the voice. There's 38 law schools, and the number of openly anti-no people, I used to say you could count it on one machine operator's hand, but I think it's probably 2 machine operators' hands now. But so, I mean, we are not representative of the law legal academia in this country. So that's the first point we're going to make. Now, I am a big civil disobedience person, but I think in many ways I probably dissent from my fellow colleagues on this panel for in a number of ways. But I just thought I'd first set out that we are a pretty unusual group to start off with. So I am not a natural law person. It leaves me cold. I lack the gene for religious belief. I just don't have it. But I was one of the earliest people. I think I started writing in the Spectator Australia, I write there weekly, against the lockdowns in March of 2020. I think Ramesh Thakur and I were the first two. And then I was doing it all over the world. So I was openly skeptical. I spent more time using my first degree of math, reading all these studies. And it was pretty clear pretty early on that the disease was about 1,000 times more lethal to over 65-year-olds than under 30-year-olds. The data on that was pretty clear from the Princess cruise ship on. So it was obvious that governments were just not telling us the facts. And the problem is, if you look at civil disobedience too simplistically, you forget that, nice, smart, reasonable people disagree about a whole bunch of things. So for instance, I take civil disobedience to be a strategy to deal with government overreach. Now you have to take the consequences of that. If you want to do civil disobedience, then if you go to jail, you go to jail. Cassius Clay, now Muhammad Ali, then he changed his name to Muhammad Ali when he converted, he went to jail for 2 years rather than go to Vietnam. Now, a lot of people at the time thought fighting in Vietnam was the right thing to do. And I sort of still think it was the right war to have. I'm not one of these people who now says, obviously, the wrong war. But, you have to admire people who put their money where their mouth is. All of these issues are fact dependent. If it had turned out to be true that COVID was like the Black Death and 1 out of 3 people died, then we would all have been wrong. And Topher should not have been doing what he was doing. It was fact dependent. It was dependent on what they were doing and all the fear mongering not being true. And it's turned out that, I think we knew early on. So I see civil disobedience as deciding that in some sort, it's a bit like jury nullification, where juries know that the person who is accused actually was guilty, but they refuse to convict. And I think jury nullification is a good thing. A lot of my colleagues don't. But you have to remember, you could be wrong too. And so it's one of many strategies. Another point you might make is civil disobedience makes no sense at all unless you have made the calculation that the government you're dealing with has a modicum of humanity. It's all very well and good for Mahatma Gandhi to lie down in front of the British troops, but you'd be an idiot to do that if you just were dealing with a Hitler or a Mao or a Stalin or today's Chinese Politburo. So civil disobedience doesn't work unless the government you're dealing with has a modicum of sort of humanity. It's all very well and good to contest the Vietnamese War, but if you were in a heavy-handed authoritarian country, if you're protesting in Iran today, they just kill you. Your options do not include civil disobedience. They include fighting or fleeing. Civil disobedience is a strategy that works when the government you're dealing with is heavy-handed and thuggish, but there's a modicum of restraint. And so anyone who professes civil disobedience in, Stalinist Russia or Hitler's Germany, I think is just making a bad choice, because it's just going to get you killed and achieve nothing. So we have to remember all these things. Last point I guess I'd make is I'm not sure that I would characterize what happened as destroying democracy the way the senator did. I'm a Churchillian about democracy. It's the worst form of government, except for everything else we've ever tried as humans. And so, of course, democracy is going to misfire sometimes. I mean, if your view is that democracy always delivers good outcomes, you're deluded. It's just that any other system is going to deliver worse outcomes over time. And so you should expect every once in a blue moon, the whole democratic system is going to misfire. And I'm all with, what I would like to see is I would like to see real consequences brought to bear on the people who made these decisions, because we know from the lockdown files in Britain that they were deliberately lying to the voters. It wasn't just that they got things wrong. That's bad, but it's not terrible. But they deliberately lied. And we know that from reading Matt Hancock's emails. And I'm sure it was true here in Australia. And so we need real consequences. Now, it's true that all of the main decision makers have left politics or been voted out here in Australia. But there's an awful lot of cabinet ministers still floating around. I'd like to see them all voted out too. Again, so I'm a bit Old Testament about this kind of thing. Until we get some real consequences on the decision makers, I'm not saying put them in jail, but I'd like to see, real actual consequences for them. And we're not seeing that at all. So again, for me, civil disobedience, it's a strategy to deal with government overreach. It's a good strategy. Again, there's no point in doing it unless you do it openly and you're prepared to take the consequences. One of the reasons I didn't protest is because I lived in Queensland, and actually nothing really happened in Queensland. If you were in Victoria, it was hell on earth. In Victoria, here in Queensland, we couldn't, you had to eat your meal at the restaurant outside. But other than that, it was hard to protest because the rules were incredibly soft. I didn't even wear a mask and nothing really ever happened. I came into work every day, nothing happened. I refused to wear a mask except when I was buying wine. I don't want viewers to think I'm a zealot. At the point of buying wine, the mask came on and I went in the store. But other than that, so you're always making a cost-benefit analysis, and in some situations it's the right thing to do, and in some it isn't.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Zimmermann, you're on mute.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Always learning from these two fellow colleagues, friends of mine. And thank you very much, Senator, for the opportunity to basically allow us to have a important conversation on this subject. So I'll see if I can add some contribution here. And I will take what I could describe as a classical liberal approach to this matter. And I also appeal to something that's very keen to me, very, very, very much in my heart, which is the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, which helps us to understand when the masses can be conducted to, I would say, resisting instances of tyranny. So I have this bad habit of sometimes writing too much, and it happened again. So I'll have to only use half of what I have done this morning. But I wanted to make sure that my opinions are very clearly expressed so that I can really provide a valuable contribution. So I would, if you don't mind, I'm going to read a little bit what I have produced this morning. So over the last years, Australians have watched their governments to use a broad range of what I would regard, and I'm pretty sure the constitutional law academics might agree with me, unconstitutional measures to remove certain rights and to control almost every aspect of our lives. And I could refer, for instance, to Section 92 of the Constitution, that it is, in theory, about keeping the borders, the interstate borders, absolutely free. And that, as you know, it didn't happen. So public authorities then have acquired these so-called emergency powers, which entitle them to detain citizens, search their properties without warrant, and close interstate and national borders, and even force entire populations into lockdown. We are here soberly reminded of Hayek's reminder, if you can say, that emergencies have always been the pretext on which the safeguards of liberty have been eroded. So this appeal to emergency allows for the imposition of arbitrary rules or commands that will dramatically affect the enjoyment of individual rights. As a consequence, agents of an oppressive state apparatuses will acquire extraordinary powers to persecute and punish those who are perceived as failing to comply with any so-called legal direction, and no legal remedy will be applied or available. Unfortunately, I must say, the drafters of the Constitution sought to design an instrument of government which is intended to distribute and therefore to limit the powers of the state. The idea that any legal provision would play a role in undermining fundamental rights represents a violation of the letter and even, I would say, the spirit of the document. Just to give an example, Section 51, 23A of the Constitution explicitly establishes a no conscription rule or requirement regarding medical or pharmaceutical treatment. This is based on the idea of informed consent, which can be defined as the voluntary agreement to a proposed medical treatment, which can be administered only after sufficient and appropriate information being provided about the potential risks and benefits, including possible adverse effects, how common they are, and what they should do about them. Of course, government or governments which have been constituted according to principles of the rule of law and constitutional government should never use its powers to destroy, enslave, or to deliberately impoverish the subject. Unfortunately, I must say, the response to the alleged pandemic by the Australian government struck a devastating blow at the realization of the rule of law. And John Locke, in his political philosophy, provides a prescription against arbitrary rule. And this prescription was enthusiastically embraced by the American founders. That being so, in their 1776 Declaration of Independence, the framers evoke a long train of abuses and the consent of the governed as the primary justifications for the lawful right to resist what they described as instances of political tyranny. Drawing from Locke's philosophy, the Declaration concludes that, and I quote from Locke, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new form of government, end of quote. And as can be seen here, the lawful right to resist arbitrary tyranny or arbitrary government constitutes an old tradition in Western constitutionalism. St. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, whose analysis has been said to amount a prescription for limited government, insisted, Aquinas, that we are bound to obey secular rulers insofar as this is required by the order of justice. Hence, if the government commands what is unjust, we are not bound to obey the law, except perhaps accidentally, in order to avoid scandal or danger. As for applying the concept of civil disobedience, so for this more particular point of applying the concept of civil disobedience, which is generally described in terms of violation of the unjust law, which is promulgated by a recognizable civil authority, Professor Gabriel Moens informs us that a system does not function adequately or properly anymore when some groups have entrenched power positions in society and use their power to impose their will on weaker or vulnerable classes of people. In this context, Professor Moens says that the exercise of civil disobedience is morally acceptable when the normal channels of social change do not function properly anymore, or whenever serious grievances are not attended or heard. Whereas these normal channels cease to function properly, and serious popular grievances are no longer properly satisfied by the entrenched political class, which is now turned into an unaccountable oligarchy, civil disobedience is therefore a morally valid way to challenge the status quo. Civil disobedience can manifest itself as an entirely valid means of disobeying an unjust law, especially when such a law results in gross violations of fundamental rights and freedoms. Of course, civil disobedience preferably should be non-violent, but it is equally important to remind that laws which result in such gross violations of human rights are themselves a form of constituted violence by the government. So in July 2021, the then police commissioner in New South Wales requested military personnel to boost the operational footprint of the police to assist with COVID restrictions compliance measures. And he said, I would absolutely have the confidence in expanding the Australian Defence Forces in New South Wales. That's the quote from him. The military contingent was called to keep people in house orders, basically house arrest, and ensuring adherence to obligatory isolation. Calling the army here to enforce lockdown rules is a declaration of war on the people of New South Wales because it entrusts army personnel with ostentations police activities.
Excuse me,
This is
Professor Zimmermann.
Mm.
Professor Zimmermann, can I interrupt you there, please? I just want to acknowledge that my appreciation for you preparing a written statement. We need to move on to Professor Flint. Perhaps you could continue when we talk about our second question.
Of course, I still have to talk about
that
the
be convenient?
doctrine of the lesser magistrate, but I can wait for that because that's my highlight. So what I really have to say is still coming.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Let's do that in answer to the second question. Thank you so much for your understanding, Professor Zimmermann. Professor Flint, over to you for 5 minutes.
Can't hear you,
Are
David.
you on mute, Professor Flint? We can't hear you, Professor Flint.
Is that better?
Well, we
Yes,
can
it
hear
is.
you.
Keep talking and the buzz will go.
Very good.
Oh, no, the buzz
Very
is
good.
gone. The buzz is gone.
Excellent. My first recollection of civil disobedience, and I'm very, very much aware of what Professor Allan was saying, that the more civilized the power is, the greater the scope for civil disobedience. My first recollection of civil disobedience was as a student at school and then the university, and it related to the very strong moral censorship which applied in relation to literature and film in Australia at the time. And what some of us engaged in, because we wanted to read Lady Chatterley's Lover, we weren't allowed to read that volume by D.H. Lawrence. So what we did was we arranged for people in other countries to take a paperback of Lady Chatterley's Lover, take it apart, and send in the post a few pages in a letter and keep on sending it until one had the whole volume. That was my very first experience. But there are, of course, more serious areas where civil disobedience is necessary. And I think what Jim Allan was saying is very true. The more civilized the power, the greater the scope for civil disobedience. And it was interesting that the freest colonies in the world, the 13 American colonies, were the ones to quickly demand their freedom when they felt that they weren't being allowed their constitutional rights in relation to taxation. And they wrote that marvelous Declaration of Independence where they they set out the principles of the exercise of power. But civil disobedience is particularly important. Sometimes it's not exercised, and something should have been done. For example, there are very harsh laws which were adopted in English-speaking countries in relation to homosexuality. And we had the destruction of one of the great literary figures of the English-speaking world, Oscar Wilde, by the very rigorous application of those laws, completely unjustly so. It's interesting to recall that a governor of New South Wales was placed in the same position, Lord Beauchamp. When Lord Beauchamp returned to England, he found himself the target of his brother-in-law. I think it was the Duke of Westminster, who revealed the fact that Lord Beauchamp, although a married man, had homosexual tendencies, and that was exposed. And the solution was to encourage Lord Beauchamp to spend the rest of his life outside of England. In fact, he visited New South Wales on 3 or 4 occasions. The problem is, I think, demonstrated particularly in France during the Second World War, when you had a legitimate regime in that it was a constitutional regime. It didn't have an attachment itself to the same outrageous racist policies of the dominant power in Europe, but it applied them. And the French authorities, including the French police, would happily, or not happily, but they certainly engaged in taking French citizens who were of Jewish origin and observing the law imposed on them by the Nazis and sending them off to the death camps. One of the features that we saw in New South Wales in recent times was the cry at the Opera House, "Where are the Jews?" At least we are told by the police that that was what was being said. Everybody else seems to have heard that the cry was "Gas the Jews," not "Where are the Jews?" But we do see in New South Wales and Australia an extraordinary toleration of anti-Semitism by the authorities, and a refusal in New South Wales to apply the law in relation to the speech, the hate speech, which is being engaged in New South Wales in various mosques in this state. There is, I think, a solution to the problem of unfair, unjust laws being imposed by the state. The solution, I don't think, is to try and vote for somebody else, because quite often somebody else takes the same position. We've seen, I think, the extraordinary position of the Liberal Party in relation to the takedown notices concerning the video of what happened in the Assyrian church in Sydney. I can see no good reason to take down videos of that. I can see reason to hide that from children, but I can't see any good reason to take down a record. The Prime Minister says that it's misinformation, but it is obviously not misinformation. It's something which happened. It was filmed from a church service, and it should obviously be available, and I cannot see any good reason for that to be taken down. And if the law supports that, then that law is deficient. I do notice, however, that the law under which the E-Safety Commissioner operates provides specifically, I think it's in section 233, that that law cannot apply in breach of the implied freedom of political communication, which the judges have found in our Constitution. I do think that there is, in many ways, a solution to this problem, a solution in representative democracies like Australia and other representative democracies. I think the Swiss have gone a long way to finding a solution, and that is by bringing in a good degree, not a dominant degree because it's impossible, but a good degree of direct democracy. And I think we saw a very good illustration of the importance.
Excuse me, Professor Flint.
direct
Did
role.
I interrupt you, please? Can we talk about citizens-initiated referendum in answer to the second question?
Certainly.
Okay, thank you so much. So now let's move to our second topic. Let's discuss preventing members of parliament and public servants like APRA, TGA, Health Department from overreaching, from breaking laws, and from acting dishonestly. How can we prevent the need for citizens to engage in civil disobedience? How can we improve the standard of our government? Professor Moens?
Well, this is an interesting and rather difficult question. Most people in Australia have a conformist attitude. They go along with whatever the government tells them to do. And this is something that I have noticed on many different occasions. I think the very important question that has been asked already is, why is civil disobedience necessary? What is wrong with the government that causes people to consider civil disobedience? And I think Augusto has made the right point here. He said that civil disobedience takes place when the normal channels of social change do not function properly anymore. And of course, in this context, I also realize what Professor Allan told us, that civil disobedience is only ever going to work if the government has a modicum of humanity and restraint. You know, in a totalitarian regime, obviously there is no place for civil disobedience. The only civil disobedience in a totalitarian regime will take you to the gallows, as Bonhoeffer experienced way back in 1945. So we have to change this conformist attitude of Australians. We have to become, as a society, far more critical of what the government tells us, because people simply enjoy a leisurely lifestyle. They do not question the government anymore. They have not become deep thinkers. They go along with everything that they are being told. Basically, the answer is we need to value and extend the extent to which we appreciate free speech in society. That is a very important point. Just one more point before I allow other people to speak. This morning, I read in the Epoch Times that a nurse in New Zealand was fined $18,000 and suspended for criticizing vaccine mandates and criticizing lockdowns. Now, the nurse had argued that she had a right to freedom of expression, but that argument was rejected by the tribunal because, according to the tribunal, these rights are not protected in the context of a public health emergency. Now, this is absolutely horrible because free speech is on the slippery slope. You know, very soon there won't be any free speech anymore, and we won't be able to have programs like the one that has been organized by the senator. That is a very important point. We should also tell the government, that civil disobedience is actually protected by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Namely, that civil disobedience is not illegal, but indeed, under international law, it is very much legal.
Thank you so much, Professor Moens. Topher?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on this one. Thank you. I think we need to begin by having a much bigger public conversation outside of just academic circles, although no disrespect to our esteemed company here, but I think the entire public needs to be engaged in a conversation about what are actually the legitimate roles and powers of government. Because I think a lot of the apathy that was mentioned comes from essentially an internalized assumption on the part of most Australians that the government can just about do whatever it likes and that there's really nothing to complain about. There's no problem until all of a sudden it hurts them directly and suddenly they kick up a fuss. But of course, there you have the classic Niemoller quote. First they came for the unionists. I wasn't a unionist, so I said nothing. If people are only objecting when it directly hurts them, then there's never enough to really be able to make much of a difference. So we need people to have a better philosophical understanding of what is the legitimate role of government, but then also to understand how to use the existing mechanisms, as Professor Allan rightly pointed out. Civil disobedience is only really practicable in countries that have some level of civilization. I would argue that every single thing that humanity has tried to limit the power of government, and this would include things like a Magna Carta, bills of rights in the US, constitutions, of whether they're constitutional monarchies or other things, the separation of powers, etc. These are all different attempts that mankind has made to limit the power of government. There's an innate recognition through a lot of history that unlimited government power is a problem, and we've tried lots of different things to fix it. All of those things have failed or are failing. And take the US Bill of Rights. Well, the First Amendment is still kind of honoured a little bit if you've got enough money. The Second Amendment is routinely breached. The Fourth Amendment is a laughingstock. So, and we see that with separation of powers here in Australia. How are we going with the courts holding governments and bureaucracies accountable for their overreaches? We just saw the news coming out of Victoria that the criminal charges for the leaking of the virus out of the hotel quarantine program have just been dropped. We saw the Ombudsman in Victoria calling out the government at the time, Premier Daniel Andrews, explicitly calling it out for human rights abuses in relation to the lockdown of some of the housing towers. And there were absolutely no consequences there. So again, we have this separation of powers, but it's not working. It's not achieving anything. And the reason for that, I believe, is because ultimately, in the end, the only thing that limits the power of a government is the people reaching the limit of their obedience. And people need to understand and have the philosophical framework to say, well, the government is going too far now, and I'm now going to engage in some level of disobedience, appropriately done, in order to bring the government back within the boundaries that are set. But the first step is that we have to know what those boundaries are. And so I think that conversation is long overdue and sorely needed, and it's one that I hope to participate in and get started at that public level.
Thank you so much. Professor Allan, I know the topic of censorship is very, very dear to your heart. Under the misinformation, disinformation bill proposed that was started by the Morrison government and now is being carried on into Parliament by the Albanese government, this podcast would be subject to censorship, but a government podcast would not. So perhaps you could say, what do we need to do for citizens to engage, to prevent citizens having the need to engage in civil disobedience? Is freedom of speech really critical?
Yeah, well, thank you, Senator. Let me first, I just want to say a few things in response to some of the comments. So look, humans are limited biological creatures. If you ask, how do we get to perfection? The answer is, we won't. We will never get to perfection. We will never be able to prevent all times when you might need civil disobedience. And Gabriel is totally right. Australians were disappointing during the regular person. They were very sheep-like. I bought a shirt in March 2020 that shows the t-shirt showing apes evolving into humans and then back down into sheep. But here's the truth of the matter. You got exactly the same response in every democracy in the world, outside of Sweden and some US southern states and South Dakota. I mean, it was worse in New York and California than here in terms of sheepishness. And it was worse in my native Canada. The government set out to scare the bejesus out of people. And when you think you're going to die, you make bad choices as a populace. It was wrong. And again, I go back. If we had been dealing with a virus that killed every second person, then what the government would have did was understandable. But it wasn't anything like that. And so it wasn't just Australians who were sheepish. It was just about everybody on the planet in the democratic world. And I'm a longtime opponent of bills of rights, and I think the 2.5 years of lockdowns prove just about everything I think to be true. I mean, all the countries with incredibly potent bills of rights, there was not one single instance in 2.5 years of some of the most thuggish, authoritarian regulations and rules, what Lord Sumption called the biggest inroads in our civil liberties in 200 years. You can't point to one instance anywhere where a judge pointed to a Bill of Rights and struck down or rolled back a regulation or a law related to these lockdowns. It was a complete and total failure, the Bills of Rights. Our Australian Human Rights Commission didn't say a peep. So talking about the ICCPR is neither here nor there. The problem with all Bills of Rights is when you buy a Bill of Rights, you buy the views of the judges who interpret them, and the judges were all on board with this. And that's the fact of the matter. They just were. They were as scared as anybody else. So the idea you can go to some legal officer and expect that person to undo the law in some way that we want as proponents of freedom is delusional. And I said that to many people. I said, I'm going to go to court. I said, you're wasting your money. So what usually happens is 3 or 4 years down the road, when everyone calms down, the judges then start, knocking these things back and pretending. It's like when they rounded up all the Japanese in World War II, and the U.S. Supreme Court said that's fine. 4 or 5 years later, there's a judicial recantation. But if everyone's subject to moral panic, it's not like judges are somehow superior moral beings. They're subject to it too. So that is exactly why civil disobedience is needed, is because the normal legal channels are not working, and they will not work until the panic subsides. And again, of course, you have to remember that you could be wrong. It's reasonable disagreement. I was struck when Augusto was talking about this great American. I come from Canadians. I have a family tree that goes back to the United Empire Loyalists. And what people forget is the American Revolution was a third revolutionaries, a third loyal to Britain, and a third, waiting to see which way the wind broke. The chips fell. And Niall Ferguson points out they were the lowest taxed people in the British Empire. What laws were it that were this horrible laws that, applied to the American colonialists? You can't point to any. It was a higher merchant class, the John Adams of the world, who wanted. If I had lived in the U.S. at the time in one of the colonies, I would not have been a revolutionary. I would have sided with the British Empire. So, the winners write the history. But if the United Empire Loyalists had won, and they would have won if Britain hadn't been fighting France in about 6 different places around the world, and if the French hadn't come in, and they wrote a great Declaration of Independence. It's great. But when you look behind it, they didn't really have too much to complain about that led to any sort of need for a war. So they won. There you go. So I don't know if your question is how do we prevent the need for civil disobedience? You can't. Hopefully, it's very seldom you need it. And I think during lockdowns it was needed. But normally you have to remember that you have a vote. Everyone has a vote. You can't expect to be on the winning side of every law. You cannot expect, Robert Mugabe is the only person who can expect to be on the winning side of every democratic decision. Some of them you're not going to like. And your remedy is to sort of vote them out. And we can talk about the problems with Australian democratic institutions later. But I think that we needed more civil disobedience. I think Topher did a great job, but it's going to be few and far between. And the problem with the misinformation bill is it is an appalling breach down the road of any sort of half-hearted even commitment to free speech. And the fact that the Liberal Party isn't jumping up and down and telling us right now they'll repeal it, even if it means a double dissolution election, this shows you the sorry state to which the once great Liberal Party has descended. It is a complete, risible party right now. But I still think we can fight off the misinformation bill. I think it's that bad. And again, it's going to take a while. But what other, if you think you're going to appeal to some judge to strike down the misinformation, here's what I tell people about the implied freedom. Every single instance in which a law has been struck down, it's been Liberal Party legislation, except for the first time. If you think that if you think you can ignore the fact that judges and lawyers today are a standard deviation to the political left of the median voter, and that the views they bring to the table are not going to be friendly to conservative politicians, then I think you're just being naive.
Thank you, Professor Allan. Professor Zimmermann, would you like to continue with your comments in response to the first question about civil disobedience?
It will be difficult now because I have to perhaps further develop on some of the comments that have been made. I'll see if I can still talk about the lesser magistrate doctrine. But my lovely and very enlightening colleagues mentioned the problems with the Bill of Rights. And I know that they are the leading academics in this particular area of expertise. But I have written articles about Bill of Rights. And the point is that, as Professor Allan and Professor Moens so eloquently expose, the idea of Bill of Rights has entirely backfired, if I can say, because undoubtedly these abstract rights provide judges with a myriad of opportunities to dictate or impose their own worldview on a more, I would say, reluctant society. everybody would agree with things such as freedom and rights in general. But when it comes to the application of these abstract principles, then judges will have so much power to dictate social policy as a result. But another thing is that perhaps what we really need is a better a rethink of constitutional frameworks. I think the Americans got it almost right when they more properly separated the branches of power. I would not expect the judicial elite here in Australia to do the right thing, especially because they come from the same elite as the political one. And they are appointed, not necessarily, in my opinion, necessarily by merit. I have the impression that this appointment of judicial officers in Australia, this process is utterly undesirable. So perhaps what you need to rethink about is to create a more rigid separation of the branches of government and make sure that judges are not appointed via political process. I would like to see judges being more independently appointed even. And as to the doctrine of the lesser magistrates, that's about a police officer, for instance, under this doctrine, who is endowed with the duty to protect the community. So, I mean, if the police officer receives an order that is in violation of protecting the community and acting as the instrument of a tyrannical regime, I think the police officer must use the doctrine of the lesser magistrate to say that this is an arbitrary command, which so grossly violating the rule of law must not be obeyed. And of course, this requires the support of the community and people who are conscious enough to understand that the role of the government is to protect what we would describe in the past, have described in the past as an inalienable right. So I would like to see, first of all, the Australian people here, my fellow citizens, to have a bit more of self-respect and a better sense of dignity so that they can start to stop behaving like slaves and have a more, I would say, appreciation for their individual rights and freedoms. And when it happens, we will be able to empower the lesser magistrates, namely politicians, members of parliament, namely police officers, to resist a higher magistrate when he violates the rule of law and disrespect grossly, I would say, very clear provisions found in the document itself in our Constitution. So our Constitution was undermined thanks to the passivity and the lack of self-dignity of so many of the official rulers or officers who we should expect to do a better job and to receive the support of the concerned citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zimmermann. I lost the last few words of what you said because you're breaking up. Your reception is not strong. So let's move to Professor Flint. And Professor Flint, I interrupted you when you were talking about citizens-initiated referendum.
Oh, it was in relation to a solution.
Over to you, Professor Flint.
Problems. Can you hear me? It was in relation to the solutions to the problem.
Breaking up somewhat.
Is that better? The problem, I think, in Australia is not the problem of the people. The fact is that the greater part of the mainstream media are not concerned with holding government to account. I don't know what the younger people do in relation to the media. I suspect a lot of them have little contact with anything which could be called the media. But that's a social problem. But I would have thought that the fact that we've had 2 referendums in this country in the last quarter of a century, both of them were ideas of the establishment. And after discussion and consideration, despite an initial flurry of approval in the first referendum, that on the Republic, it was defeated 55-45 and in every state. And the second one on the Voice was defeated 61, I think 61-49.
39.
And,
39.
39.
39, sorry. And in every state. And I think
Except
we
for
should
Canberra.
put a lot of credit into the opinions of the ordinary people of Australia, and what the Swiss do in that regard seems to be the way to tap into the opinions of the ordinary people, and that is to empower them to initiate referendums. In Switzerland, as you know, it's available every 3 months and available at all levels of government. And this is a marvelous way of controlling the politicians in the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Flint. Look, let's move on to our third topic. It may be similar in some of your answers to the answers to the second topic, but what I'd like to do is to invite you all in turn to discuss democracy, and specifically what's required for democracy to succeed. Some of the people have already answered this to some extent, but what is required, Professor Moens, for democracy to succeed in Australia?
Yes, you are quite right. In a way, I have already answered the question, and so have other people as well. What we need is freedom of speech. Freedom of speech in this country is curtailed dramatically. Yet, freedom of speech is protected by paragraph 2 of Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I quote, according to which everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This paragraph, this article protects not only verbal communication, but also actions, like, for example, a civil disobedient actions. These actions have been described in the United States sometimes as examples of symbolic speech. There are quite a number of Supreme Court cases on this particular issue. And it goes back to a case decided in 1948. If I remember correctly, it was Musser and Utah. So we need free speech, and there is in this country an abrogation of free speech, which is terrible. I find, and people didn't speak up when we were tyrannized by the government during the COVID-19 era. And James has mentioned the misinformation and disinformation laws. Augusto and I have written rather extensively about that horrible piece of proposed legislation, but it is as if the government is pushing through more and more items of social engineering legislation. When you come to think of it, during the last 5 years, what kind of social engineering legislation that has been adopted, you will be astounded. Everybody will be astounded. I'm talking about euthanasia laws, gender dysphoria laws, prohibition of conversion practices, laws with regard to preferential treatment, climate change legislation, zero emissions policies, critical legal studies, destruction and desecration of monuments. Shall I go on? The list is absolutely endless, and people do very little at all to try to stop these abominations. And very soon, as I said, there will be no freedom of speech anymore. I do agree, though, with James and Augusto that we definitely should not have a Bill of Rights, because a Bill of Rights inevitably consists of a vague, indeterminate language, which would be an ideal vehicle for activist judges to read their own biases and philosophies and ideology into such a document. They would become quasi-legislators. So we need free speech. That is the way to go to try to hold our government accountable and to try to recuperate some of the normalness that existed in Australia when I first came to this country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Moen. And just to build on what you've just said, and also what Professor Allan said, we've either seen the identity verification bill come into existence just a few months ago under the Labor Party government, but it was introduced as a discussion point by the Morrison government. We next see the digital identity bill, which is now in the Parliament, and I think the Labor government may be scared to put it into the House of Reps. Maybe not. We combine that with the misinformation, disinformation bill, the censorship bill. Combine that with the new payments platform. And by the way, the Liberal Party, to take a leaf out of James Allan's comments, all of these bills were introduced or discussion papers started under the Liberal Party. So we see misinformation, disinformation bill first released by Morrison's government. Then we see the new payments platform, which records every single financial transaction in this country. We see the digital identity bill encompass every piece of information about every single Australian ultimately. So we'll all have a number plate. We see the Reserve Bank of Australia developing a digital currency. So we have all the hallmarks, building upon what James Allan said and Gabriel Moens said. We have all the hallmarks for a social credit system, which means complete control. Topher, what do you see as the way to protect democracy or to ensure democracy?
Well, certainly protecting freedom of speech first and foremost, and I was involved in the fight against Julia Gillard's News Media Council, which is, as Orwellian as it sounds, came out of the Finkelstein report. We defeated that just as we can, and we will defeat these new efforts to try and curtail free speech. One very quick point on free speech that I don't think gets made often enough. When you silence hate speech, what you're actually silencing then is also the arguments back against that hate speech. So not only you're not protecting people from hearing hate speech, you're stopping them from actually understanding the counter arguments back against that. And so when they hear those same sentiments expressed to them in other forums that aren't regulated, such as offline, in the pub, in the workplace, in the home, they're not actually equipped with the counter arguments. So I think the effect of even with hate speech, the effect of censorship is actually to have the reverse of what they say, which is that hate speech will actually proliferate more and people won't be equipped with the counter arguments. But to the question at hand, how do we achieve this? Incentives matter. I don't remember who it was that coined the maxim, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. And from my perspective, there is not enough, fear is perhaps too strong of a word, but I think maybe it's not. There is not enough fear of consequences on the part of our politicians and on the part of our bureaucrats for when they do get it horribly, horribly wrong. Now, let me say, there needs to be a certain amount of protection. We can't have a situation where everyone that goes into public life is going to spend the rest of their life being dragged through courts for every decision they make. There is a valid need for protection, but there has to be a limit on that protection to them in order to draw a boundary around just how far they might be willing to go, how much of a risk they might be willing to take with people's lives. We saw the precautionary principle being invoked in relation to COVID. And I think in the very early stages, that might have been justified. By the end of March, we had good data out of Italy, out of Israel, out of Sweden, and also from a couple of these cruise ships. We understood a lot more about the virus, and the precautionary principle as a blanket rule across all demographics of society no longer applied. We knew who was at risk. But what there was lacking was any sense of a precautionary principle on the other side. We need to not shut down the economy because out of abundance of caution, we don't know what this is going to do to people. That precautionary principle never came up. And I wonder if there was a greater awareness amongst bureaucrats and politicians of their own vulnerability, their own potential liability, whether we might have seen more care being taken for the potential harms that could be done by those policies. So I would like to see a much greater amount of accountability. Is that a silver bullet that fixes everything? No. I think Professor Allan is exactly correct. We're never going to get to a situation where civil disobedience is redundant. But I do think we need to get to a situation where, one, the population is much more aware of the limits of reasonable government power, much more aware of their power and what civil disobedience can do. And the bureaucrats and politicians, I believe, need to be much more acutely aware of the risk that they take when they start to play God in people's lives, because there must be a point at which they can then be held personally liable. And I don't think we've got that right in this country yet.
Thank you, Topher. Professor Allan?
Yeah, okay, so what to do to protect democracy? Well, you got the long, in-depth answer and you got the short answer. The long, in-depth answer is we have to go right back and, fight the culture wars, because our young people are getting a horrible education. Leave aside that we rank below Kazakhstan. I mean, they're not even taught to have any basic sort of patriotic views about their own country. So it's no wonder democracy is not overly valued amongst the young. Have you seen the kind of schooling they're getting? And the sort of the Anglo countries did more to end slavery than any countries on earth. And how many students know that more slaves were sent to South America by far than North America, and more again went to the Islamic world? Zero. And so the long answer is that we first have to take back the cultural institutions, fight the culture wars, and go back to a sort of far better education system. The shorter answer has to do with incentives, because people respond to incentives, including politicians. We have a bad voting system. There's only 2 countries in the world that have preferential voting. It's like a protection racket for the 2 main parties. I have friends say, "Oh, I got mad at the Liberals, so I didn't vote for them." I said, "Where did you preference them?" "I preferenced them 4th." "Where did you preference the Labour Party?" 5th. I said, "You voted for the Liberal Party." It doesn't matter where you put them on your ballot. And only, I think, Australia and Nauru have this voting system. In first past the post, and I don't like proportional systems, but on this score, they're better. You are able to punish the party that you would normally want to vote for. In first past the post, you just go in and vote for the monster raving loony party, and in proportional voting, you go and vote for one of the small parties. We are not able to do that. And so the big 2 vehicles, the center right, center left, they just take your vote for granted largely. And that's a real problem. What I would say to Augusto, because he and I normally agree on things, I think he's completely wrong about the appointment of judges. We don't want less political input into appointment of judges. We want more political input, because the alternative to politicians appointing judges is either some bureaucrat does it, or the law society and the judges themselves do it, the way you sort of see in Israel. And if you think you're going to get good outcomes as a center-right person from letting the bureaucracy or letting the judges appoint their own successors, again, you're deluded. I mean, we're going to end up with, the kind of judges we like, Dyson Hayden, Ian Callan, they would never, ever, ever get appointed under those processes. They're all sold under the rubric of merit, but it's, merit is partly in the eye of the beholder. And if you want interpretively conservative judges, the Law Society and the Bar Council aren't going to give you those. So the only remedy is the sort of, I think Donald Trump got this exactly right. If you look at how center-right parties in Australia or Britain or Canada have appointed top judges, the answer is they've done a terrible, terrible, terrible job. What you need to do is publish in advance a list of potential appointees and promise to pick from that list, because that way you'll never appoint the wife of the retiring high court judge or the daughter of another retiring judge. And you might actually pick some people, the Love decision was brought to you by Liberal Party appointees. Overturning Al-Qaeda was brought to you by Liberal Party appointees. So it's true they've made all of these terrible sort of legislative choices, but on appointments, they're even worse. And so they're still better than you'd get out of any kind of bureaucratic appointment process. So we have real problems on that front, but we don't want less political input, because the only chance we have on the right of politics is to win an election and appoint people that we want to appoint. So I think that one's completely wrong. I would try to go to, as a first step, optional preferential voting. That's the best we can hope for in the short term. And optional preferential voting will allow us to discipline the Liberal Party, which is why they don't want to let us have it.
Thank you so much, Professor Allan. I agree entirely. Optional preferential voting, and I understand why it was changed back to compulsory, and I understand who changed it, both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party. Professor Zimmermann, would you like to add?
I would like to say something about
for
this.
Democracy to succeed. Sorry, Professor.
James, I'm not entirely.
Yeah, Professor Allan, did you want to say something?
No, I've finished. I'm done.
I'm not entirely in disagreement, quite to the contrary. I think I perhaps didn't express myself properly. One of the ways in which we can actually have more checks and balances is to have Senate approval of the choices made by the government of the day. And the Senate is not necessarily controlled by the government. You know that from time to time, the Senate is not controlled by the government of the day. I remember that when I was appointed the commissioner, I received a phone call from the then Attorney General saying, well, look, you belong to my club. So I expect you to serve the best interests of the party. I don't think this is a desirable way to appoint a commissioner. So what I'm saying is that perhaps even in Brazil is a good example of this, that some judges who have gone through a process of public examination, they actually had to sit an exam to become judges and had to prove that they are capable on merit grounds. That should perhaps be combined with a selection on politically speaking, if I can say. So I think judges should be appointed not just by belonging to a club. So that's what I was trying to convey, the message that I was trying to convey. I think that the way judges are appointed too undesirable. But moving on this issue, I have to talk about the idea of parousia, which is a Greek concept of free speech. The Greeks believed that only citizens had the right to express their opinions freely. A slave would be described as the person who doesn't have such a right. And what the political class is doing in Australia is basically to turn us into subjects without or devoid of any sort, or devoid, better saying, of any sort of right to express our political opinions. And it makes me quite suspicious that they have, therefore, an agenda to accomplish, because when they talk about misinformation, disinformation bill, it's based on the idea that the government always gets things right. And I don't think they actually understand the mood of the ordinary citizen now, when we are starting to be more suspicious of what governments can do and what they promised us to deliver. Think about, for instance, that during COVID, the government was saying that anybody who disagreed from the health directions was potentially committing an act of terrorism, even. The disinformation bill simply happens to be opinions that are not in line of what the establishment wants to dictate open as ordinary citizens. And when it happens, I must make this point very clear, we cease to have a normal system of representative government, because these people think that they are somehow special characters who can actually have laws and rights that do not even apply to themselves, or apply only to themselves. So we have to think about being suspicious of what the governments are saying, and make sure that this misinformation bill is not passed, so that this is going to reduce the scope for engagement in the public debate. I think it's going to be pretty much the final destination towards the accomplishment of an elective dictatorship. Of course, it is an elected government, but it doesn't mean that this government attends the requirements of the public in general. Quite to the contrary, these people believe that they are above the law. They believe that they are better than us, and they do not behave as our public servants, elected public servants, who should actually listen and hear to the demands of the masses. I mean, they are not better than us. They should be working for us and not treating us as disposable human beings. And the vaccine and the other experiments that were envisaged on us actually should teach us a lesson that these people are not necessarily attending the best interests of the community. So I would tell you very frankly that if this misinformation, disinformation bill is passed, that will spell the end of normal democratic mechanisms, because anybody who dares to express opinions that are not in line with the establishment will have to pay a very heavy price, and might even have to, if they do have, as me, think about using a second passport and getting rid of this tyrannical society, I must say.
Thank you very much, Professor Zimmermann. Professor Flint, over to you. What do we need to do for democracy to succeed?
Well, I would very much like to see the politicians and the bureaucrats being made more accountable. I'd like to see that until I see what's happening to Donald Trump, where they're using the instruments of accountability to block a candidate from the election in the United States. I find that a great pity. I think we can only rely on the people. This is a democracy. What we must do, we must empower the people, and in relation to the politicians, let them fear a recall election, for example. It would be something that we would no doubt throw ourselves into to organize in a particular case and allow the people to initiate referendums. We have to trust the people. The young people, unfortunately, have been polluted through the education system, which has been taken over very much by the Marxists, and they have substituted indoctrination for education. But once again, I think the final solution is really to empower the people.
Thank you so much, Professor Flint. Now, finally, before we wrap up, I would just invite each of you. I was going to read a quote from the American Declaration of Independence, but you people have gone way beyond that, So thank you so much. How can people connect? How can our viewers connect with your work, your views? Do you want to list your books, or give a venue for people accessing your books, other works, newsletters, videos, website, social media, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube? Let's go first with Professor Gabriel Moens. How can people who are watching this learn more about you and understand your work,
definitely
Professor
not going
Moens?
to list my books because I don't want to impair your sanity. You would still be here tomorrow morning, so I can't do that to you. During the last couple of years, I write many opinion pieces. They are getting published in Quadrant, The Spectator, in the Epoch Times, sometimes other journals and newspapers as well. From time to time, I also write novels. I have written 2 novels, and a third one is on the way. They all deal with the topical issues. The last novel I have written deals with an attempt to assassinate the American president, but I can tell you the attempt was totally unsuccessful. I also teach. I continue to teach. I enjoy teaching, not at the University of Queensland, mind you, but I teach international commercial law at the University of Sydney. So I'm very much involved in the intellectual debates in Australia, in the cultural wars. And I always tell my wife, that I have only just started my career, even though I'm nearly 77.
Thank you so much. And over to you, Topher. Please list
Thank you so much.
And get your material.
All right. Well, can I just firstly say I've only got 2 of their books here, but Professor Moens and Zimmermann write extremely well and often collaborate on works, and I do commend their works and their books to you. For myself, Good People Break Bad Laws. This is a mix of some anecdotes and my own story from the pushback against the lockdowns in Melbourne, but really that's not what it's about. It is mostly about both the history and the political philosophy of civil disobedience. It's designed to be easily read. It's designed, I wrote it with my, at the time, 12-year-old niece in mind. So it's deliberately written to be very, very accessible. And so if you don't feel like you're ready for the really sophisticated stuff that my esteemed colleague, well, not colleagues, but the esteemed professors here produce, then that might be a really accessible way in. So goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com is where you'll find that. You'll also find my shirts like Don't Make Me Repeat Myself, which is history, is saying don't make me repeat myself, which unfortunately is exactly what we're doing to history right now. But also then the Battleground Melbourne documentary. I really, really, really encourage anyone that hasn't seen it, please go to battlegroundmelbourne.com. It's completely free. You can watch it just right there on the website without giving me an email address, without giving me anything. You can just watch it and learn about what happened in Melbourne and that civil disobedience journey that I went on, along with, in the end, a couple of 100,000 of my fellow Victorian citizens. And finally, 100% the best way to keep in touch with me, obviously jump on my socials, it'd be great, at Topher Field on every single social media platform. But if you go to topherfield.net and join my email list, that way I'll be able to keep in touch with you. I do get shadow banned and or kicked off social media platforms from time to time. So goodpeopleBreakBadLaws.com for the book and the shirts, battlegroundmelbourne.com for the documentary. Yep.
Yeah, if I could just add that the Battleground Melbourne is a very, very powerful, emotional, highly effective video. And for those who don't know how to spell Topher, it's the second half of Christopher, Topher, Topher Field. So fabulous material. Professor Allan?
I'm still marveling that Gabriel is only 77. He's looking pretty damn good. I just have to say there, Gabriel, you're standing the test of time nicely. Yeah. You're very well done. I do not do social media. I'm an openly conservative law professor at a G8 university. So social media and I probably don't would just get my blood pressure up. I write weekly for The Spectator, occasionally for The Australian. I was in this week. You have to be careful about not taking journalism too seriously. I mean, it's an ethereal occupation. I mean, almost no one can remember a journalist from 15 years ago. If you think of the great journalists in the last 100 years, you sort of got Alistair Cook and H.L.A. Mencken, and that's it. It's hard. It's a fairly ethereal undertaking. Social media is even worse. It has a shelf life of half a second. So my latest book is called The Age of Foolishness. It's an American publisher. It's sort of accessible, I think. I didn't aim it at sort of the lawyerly cast particularly, because the lawyerly cast and I don't agree on anything. So, that's where I sit, and I think we all have to try to just be brave. I've always said the most important thing is not intelligence. Brains are a dime a dozen. It's sort of bravery. We don't have enough bravery, especially on the sort of conservative side of the political spectrum. And I think we need to encourage people to be a bit braver, because that next to a sense of humor are the two most effective tools against the sort of thuggish worldview we're dealing with.
Thank you so much, Professor Allan. Professor Zimmermann, how do people learn more about you and how you think?
Well, just to say that I'm a great admirer of all these distinguished colleagues who are exposing their work, and I know their work quite well. I must highly recommend that everybody should know what they do. I have written, and I continue to do so many articles on these subjects, and they are primarily published in well-known media outlets, such as Quadrant, The Spectator. I even had to put a list here: Epoch Times, Cauldron Pool, Mercator, and the list goes on. And another thing I do when I have the opportunity is to write books. And this is the latest book I wrote with Professor Gabriel Moens, The Unlucky Country, Everything We Need to Know. It's quite a thick book, you see. There's lots of things to say of how unlucky we have become. So the name of the book, it's The Unlucky Country, and we have almost 500 pages, I guess, to explain this position of ours. And I published together with Gabriel Moens Foundations of the Australian Legal Systems to see if the lawyers can learn anything from us, because it seems that the legal profession needs to be better equipped. Their knowledge of the rule of law and the knowledge of constitutional government is defective. They are this knowledge is needing to be improved, if I can say. So we have given our contribution in this regard. And of course, Topher referred to emergency powers, COVID-19 restrictions, and mandatory vaccination from a rule of law perspective. So I can rest, I can have my conscience clear that I'm trying to do my best. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zimmermann. Professor Flint, how do people learn more about you and your thinking? You're muted, Professor. Professor Flint, you're muted.
Trying to save you from noise. I'm in the usual places, and I have a regular program on 2GB, which is on their website, and occasionally 2CC, Spectator, and the new platform ADH TV, which is becoming Osmax TV. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I did, in preparing for the show, with the American Henry David Thoreau, his book, his essay, Civil Disobedience. I'll just read very briefly from it. Another line in the essay says, "I hardly accept the motto that government is best which governs least," is also well known, and it was his line of thinking about justice when he argued that conscience can be a higher authority than government. That stuck with civil rights leaders Martin Luther King and Mohandas Gandhi. I want to thank all my guests for pointing out that when governments are honest and do not assault citizens and instead serve citizens, we have the foundation for effective governance. Thank you so much for the guests, all five: Professor Allan, Professor Moens, Professor Field, Topher Field, Professor Zimmermann, and Professor David Flint. Thank you so much for your frankness and for your nobility and your courage, and also your succinctness. Until our next show, this is Professor. I'm joining myself now as Professor. Until our next show, this is Senator Malcolm Roberts. I'm staunchly pro-human, pro-nature, pro-truth, proud of who we are as humans, and a believer in the inherent goodness and care in human beings. While we need to acknowledge the pain and then take a minute to appreciate the abundance and potential in all of us and around all of us, please remember to listen to and to love one another. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Stay, don't